Welcome chess friends. This video is based on Step 2 Plus winning material. We will focus on how to find winning moves. We know, especially children, they are very impulsive behind the board. They see a good move and they want to immediately play it. But if you have followed my steps method videos, you know that I distinguish 3 steps. First, there's the orientation. We look at the position characteristics, undefended pieces, checks on the king, mating threats. So those are the attacking targets. We look at vulnerable pieces. We look at 2 pieces on one line that can be pinned, and so on. Then, after our opponent has moved, we ask ourselves the question, what has changed in the position? And what is the opponent's threat? And often when people say the opponent's threat, it sounds a bit abstract, but the easiest way to think about it is to say, if my opponent was to move, what would they do? What would they do if they were to move? Then we get to candidate moves and we calculate variations, and at the end of the evaluation we have to visualize the final position and evaluate who is better. And finally, we have to do the verification. And in the verification step, we visualize the candidate move that we're going to play and ask ourselves one more time the question, did we really consider the strongest reply of our opponent? And in the visualization of this final candidate move, we also really take a sharp look at what has changed in the position and how the cooperation between the pieces on the board has changed. Okay, enough words, let's go to the puzzles. So this is the first puzzle, and on the dot next to H1, you can see it's a black dot. That black is to move. And when we start with the orientation here, we see that the queen on D7 is under attack by the bishop on A4. And we see that the knight is attacking the queen on D3. So it would be very easy, of course, if you think immediately about moves, you could say, oh, I can take the queen. Knight takes D3. And I won a queen, and then be happy. But then you have to consider, what will your opponent do? Bishop takes D7. And the bishop on D7 is attacking both rooks. So white is going to be up an exchange on the next move. So we have to take a pause and think like, can I do anything better than just taking on D3? And in many exercises, you could say that we do an intermediate move, an in-between move. And in this case, it's like a desperado. So the queen will give herself up, right? So first we play queen A4, and then after knight A4, black takes on D3, and black won a piece. Black has 2 knights and white has 1 knight. So the first common theme in these winning material exercises is that there is an in-between move before we could say execute the main tactic, and this in-between move gives us the winning advantage. So let's have a look here and do the orientation and see what's going on. So black is to move, the dot next to H1. Black can take the queen, or not, right? So if you are very impulsive and excited, you can say, rook takes f6, I won the queen. But then you will be mated. So we have to verify and consider the strongest reply of our opponent. But now that we know, right, that rook takes f6 is not working, we can start to think about this position, and we see that the mate on g8 is dependent upon the two rooks. So again, we have, you could say, an intermediate move, a move that we play before the main tactic, the capture, which is queen takes g1 check, rook takes g1, and rook takes f6. And in the first and the second example, we see that those desperados and intermediate moves often are forcing moves like captures and checks. So in this case, white is the move. Look at the white dot next to h1. And right, you could be very excited and say, I'm going to take the rook, and I'm a rook up. Or you can say, I'm going to promote the pawn, and then the rook has to give themselves up for the pawn, and I'm a bishop up. But we have to consider what happens if we take the rook, right? So if you're very impulsive, then you would play bishop takes e4, and you would be very happy because you gained a full rook. But what's the strongest reply after bishop e4? Well, black can play king f7, and then we lose the pawn on e7, because it's on a dark square and cannot be defended by the bishop. And in the end, white is left with insufficient mating material. The same happens after queening. The rook takes, and we again have insufficient mating material. So before we execute this variation and do one of the two moves, we need an intermediate move. And in this case, it's bishop d5, forcing the king away. And then after king h8, we can take the rook. So this is the third example of an intermediate move. And let's have a look what's going on here. White is to move. And we look at the undefended pieces, of course, and many undefended pieces. But there's only one capture related to it. The rook on d2 can capture the bishop. So an impulsive chess player would take the bishop and be happy. But let's go to the third step, verification of the candidate move. Rook takes d7. What does black have? Let's first start with checking the checks and the captures. Rook b2 is a check. The king goes to h3. And then suddenly rook h1 is a mate. So if we would just be impulsive and take the piece, and not ask the question, what are the threats by black in this position? What would I do if I were black? Then we would be mated. So we have to go back to the drawing board and see if we can find an intermediate move to prevent that rook b2. And again, we have a forcing move, bishop f6, and that's dual purpose, right? It checks the king, so it is with force, but it also handily defends the square on b2. And that was the square that the rook on b8 wanted to go to mate. And now after king f8, we can play rook takes d7. So for winning material, we have to consider the strongest reply of our opponent. And sometimes what we have to do is an intermediate move to prepare the capture, or we have a desperado to avoid just an exchange, but to give up the piece that was about to be captured for additional material, and after that capture the piece of the opponent. So let's look what's going on here. Black is the move, and of course, when you look at this position, you could be very excited because you can say the pawn can capture the knight and afterwards can capture on e2 with the pawn. And if black captures back, then I won a piece. And so if you are immediately going to moves without orientation, that's where your head would go. If you start with the orientation and the position characteristics, you would say, are there any undefended pieces? And you would come to the conclusion that g4 is undefended. And then you start calculating and you say, oh, if I take on f3, and I do the verification, what has changed in the position? What has changed in the position? And then you would find out, of course, that the fourth rank has opened up. And you would ask yourself the question, what's the strongest reply of the opponent? And then you would say, queen takes g4 check. And of course, it's very crucial that queen takes g4 comes with a check, because it also eliminates the threat of the f3 pawn taking on e2. So e takes f3, queen takes g4, check on the black king, and afterwards we can take the pawn on f3. So this is how it works with those three steps: orientation, calculation, evaluation, and then the verification of the final candidate move. Now that we know that, we can evaluate the other capture, right? So we can play g takes f3, and if white does not want to lose a piece here immediately and says, I'm going to take back with the pawn, we capture again, and then we trap the bishop on c1, and on the next move we will win a piece. Again, let's do the orientation for this winning material exercise. A lot of tension, right? Of course, if you look at this, you would say the bishop is attacking the queen, and this bishop is attacking this bishop. So what to do? And this queen can also take this bishop. And a lot of players, they would say, okay, I play bishop takes f5, bishop takes a5, and then bishop takes c2, and I win a queen. Now they would say bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5, bishop takes a5, bishop takes c2, and black has 3 minor pieces and white has 2 minor pieces. Black is a bishop up. But then we have to go to step 3 and verify our candidate move, that after bishop f5 is white to move, and white has a desperado. Can you find a desperado for white? What is the strongest reply by white after bishop takes f5? And then when you ask a question like that, you say, of course, queen takes c6, right? And then you see the refutation of this line. So a lot of players would calculate this at first and would be very happy because they would say black is a piece up. But then they go back, and then in this position they have to ask themselves, did I consider the strongest reply of my opponent? And if they think like, can white do anything else? And they are familiar with this concept of desperado, it's like an in-between move, you could say, an intermediate move. Then they say, yes, queen takes c6 is possible. But all this, of course, is only possible when you take a little bit time to think and you don't move just impulsively. Take in the position and think about the threats of your opponent and the best replies of your opponent. That's the critical part. So when we are having this position, right, it's likely that white just took a knight on c6 with the queen. And black can be very happy and say, oh, bishop takes c6 wins the queen. But the first element of the orientation is to say, what is the threat of the opponent, right? And the threat of the opponent, like I mentioned, is just saying if white was to move, what would they play? Black is to move in this position, but you can ask yourself, if white was to play, what would they do? And then you look from the other side and you say, oh, I had mate in 1 with the move knight e7. So when you ask that question, what is the threat of my opponent? Then you will never impulsively play the move bishop takes c6 anymore. So the critical thing is actually asking that question and making that into a habit. And that's not easy. Once you have identified that that is the threat of the opponent, then you can say, oh, actually, what I can do is I can take the queen because the bishop on b7 has an X-ray defense to the queen on d5. A position where there's a lot going on. If you are impulsive, you say the knight is attacking the queen, the rook is pinning the pawn on d5, I'm taking the knight and I'm winning a piece. And that's where it would end. If you would start by saying, if black was to move, what would black play? What are the undefended pieces on the white side? Then you would answer that with, if black was to move, black would take the bishop on g5. And suddenly, right, now if you think about your impulse idea, bishop takes e4, you verify, is queen takes g5 still a good move? Yes, it is. So it's not gaining anything because black gets out of the pin and can take the bishop back on the next move. Now that we know that, right, we see that this bishop, there's so much more going on, right? This bishop is attacking this queen, this knight is attacking. There's a pin here, and this bishop is attacking the knight. Now that we know that, we can go back to our idea of an intermediate move, a forcing move. In this case, to get our queen into safety and defend the bishop on g5. How can you accomplish that? At the same time, bring the queen into safety, defend the bishop on g5, and only after that take the knight on e4, right? Or take the queen on d8 for that matter. So queen e5, queen e5, king f8, bishop takes d8, and white is winning. But you see how it works with considering the threat of your opponent, and suddenly all the moves become easy by asking the right question. What is going on here? White has a very advanced pawn that is about to promote. And an impulsive player would say, I'm going to promote, because if the rook takes, I take back with the rook and it is mate. That's what I'm going to do. But chess is not checkers. So in this position, after d8, we have to again ask ourselves, what is the strongest reply of our opponent? And the strongest reply is definitely not taking the queen and being mated. That's, of course, that's very complacent. So, for instance, black would say, I'm just going to defend this this rook and attack the queen, and perhaps I can go to b3 later, and I'm safe. So let's go back, and if we are in this position, we could ask ourselves the question: does white have a mating threat? Right. So there were 3 targets in the steps method: material, the king, a check on the king, and the third one is a mating square. And in the other videos, I explained a very practical way that you can often find it. That is by making 2 moves with the same color and mating. And I think for a lot of starting players, they would never have considered it in this position. And it's even difficult, right? So you could say, if you don't know the moves, you could say, I'm going to pick up the rook and say, if I can put this rook anywhere on the board, where would it be made? And then even beginning players would tell me rook h8 would be made. And then we can figure out the route. I would ask them, how can you get to h8 in 2 moves? They say, that's easy, coach. I can play rook h8, 1, rook h8, mate. Now we have to think about what can the opponent do after rook h1 to make sure that they are not mated, right? And the only move to prevent it is king g8, but then the pawn can take the rook with mate. So in the end, black will get mated, but it was very important not to go into this impulsive promotion. Consider the fact that black is not forced to take, but just can mobilize their queen. And now, after rook h1, black can defend with king h8 and is safe. So I was talking about orientation. What are the position characteristics? Undefended pieces was 1, checks on the king, right? King safety. But also 1 was 2 pieces on 1 line. And there's a tactical theme related to 2 pieces on 1 line. So here, of course, it stands out that the knight and the queen are on 1 line. And the tactical theme related with 2 pieces on 1 line is the pin. So when you identify the characteristic, right, in your calculation evaluation, you can call up in your head the tactical theme associated with two pieces on one line, and then you will find the winning move rook h4. So in the step method, there are three things related to the pin. The first one is create the pin, right? So in this case, we create the pin. The second one is attack the pinned piece one more time. The third one is a pinned piece is a poor defender. So when you're thinking about pins, create a pin when there are two pieces on one line. Add one additional attacker. The third one is a pinned piece is a poor defender, and often squares are available that you would consider not available because it's under attack. It seems like, but it's actually not. So in this case, right, let's have a look at this position. What stands out? Okay, there's an undefended bishop here, but the king is still in the middle. So that's something that stands out. And a lot of players, they would say, I see it. Bishop takes e7, king takes bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, rook e2, and I'm winning the queen by pinning it. But then you have to ask yourself the question, did you consider in the verification step the strongest reply of your opponent? Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, rook e2. Is there anything better that black can do? And then it looks, of course, very strange. But after bishop takes e7, black can take with the king. And of course, white is better developed in this king, right? The rooks are not yet in the game. Black is a pawn up, and the game goes on. So if we go back to this position, right? We wanted to play bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, rook e2. Okay, so we're going to use another step method idea. If a combination doesn't work, let's try to see what happens if we reverse the move order. So the second move goes first. The second move in the variation that we had planned was rook e2. So we start with rook e2, and that's the winning move. Now we win the knight on e7, and we get a winning position because we win a full piece. Again, we are looking here at a full board. What is undefended? When we do in the orientation, we say the rook on h8 is undefended. We have two attackers, two defenders on f6. So I call that the power balance. The power balance on the knight on f6 is 0. 2 minus 2. So in a way, it's the same as an undefended piece. Now, the question is, can we create a pin and add an attacker to the knight? And now we see everything in action at the same time, right? This knight on c6 is pinned, which means it's a poor defender. And what was this knight defending? The square on d4. So we play the move queen d4. Knight on c6 is a poor defender. The rook on h8 is undefended. We created a pin. Now there are three attackers on the knight. and it's impossible for black to defend. And if the knight moves, we take the rook with check. So we saw all three in action. Finally, a difficult one. What is going on here? When we were talking about targets in chess, we said there are three targets. There is a square, a mating square. There's the king with a check, and there's material. And to find a mating square, right, we could say two moves with the same color and mate. Of course, we prefer safe moves, right? So you would ask yourself the question, two moves with the same color and mate, right? You can say, oh, I have an idea. Bishop takes h6, queen g7 checkmate. Then you think like, okay, but that doesn't work because the bishop just gets taken by the g-pawn. But we did find a vulnerability in the black position by doing this small mental exercise, which is the fact that g7 could be a target square. So at the moment, right, there's no pin in the position, but we can find a different route for the bishop to support the cooperation with the queen for attacking the pawn on g7, which is the move. Can you find it? Bishop c3. So I hope today what you saw is that when you start playing, often you're very impulsive. If you can split the process of orientation and calculation and evaluation, so first take a moment to take in the position, see what's going on, look at the position of the king, undefended pieces, look at what your opponent tries to do, what their threat is and their plan, then go to moves that fit with the characteristics and using the chess steps concepts. And then finally, when you have selected your candidate move, to go back one more time and think about, okay, now I'm going to look at the position as if my candidate move has been played. And I'm going to ask myself, did I really consider the strongest reply of my opponent? And that's a very important final check. Now the question is, playing impulsively or without thinking, it's a bit of a habit, and it's easier said than done. So how to change this habit? And I think you have to find a way for yourself to change something in the way you play chess. So what I suggested to some of my students, it's just a simple idea, is that when you record your games, after you record the move of your opponent, you do the first thing. You think about what are the position characteristics and what are the opponent's threat and plan. And after you've done that, right, so you record the move of your opponent, you put a dot behind the move of your opponent to confirm that you have completed the process of orientation. Then you calculate, evaluate, you select your candidate move, you write down your candidate move before you play it, and then you go to the verification. You think about, okay, what will change in the dynamics between the pieces when I play my move? Did I not overlook anything, like a rank suddenly opened up and suddenly one of my pieces is hanging? You really think, what is the strongest reply of my opponent? We saw several times they can have um, a surprising capture, or they can right? Yes, like we said, with king takes e7 or queen takes e6 in the puzzles. Then you have to go back. Once you have done that, you put a dot behind your own move and say, okay, I verified my final candidate move. Everything is okay. I'm ready to play it. This is just one way. Perhaps you know a better way, but you have to think about how you're going to change the habit, because it does not come naturally. You have to really change something to make it happen. Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you like it, please subscribe and check out my other chess tips videos. Thank you very much and have a nice day.